In the name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Can you remember the first time you were ever lost? Perhaps when you were younger, driving as a young adult, or even before that. What early memories of being lost come up for us as we reflect on the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin? And losses and being lost are not experiences that we want to remember. We depend these days on Google Maps and phones or computers in our cars to help us get from A to B. We need that GPS signal. We trust more in technology to get us around, and as a result, we lose a kind of innate ability to learn the routes and the neighborhoods and the geography of how to get from A to B on our own knowledge and experience. I remember the first time I ever was lost. I was 9 years old. I grew up in Belfast, which was a big metropolitan city, and I decided to get on one of those big red double-decker buses and to go into the center of the city on my own. And it was a great adventure, and I got off, and there was City Hall, lots of traffic, lots of people. And I wandered around looking for about an hour, and then I realized that I had no idea where I was and how I was going to get on the bus to get me home. And after a while, I just started sobbing. I just started crying. And this passerby wanted to know what was wrong with me, and I just said, I'm lost. I don't know how to find my way home. I remembered the number of the bus, but that was about it. And he said, your bus stop is just right there. It was the place where they dropped me off. And so I got back on the bus and I got home. And it was kind of a frightening experience, but you know what? In 65 years of life, I have traveled the world. I moved to America, I have lived in the UK, I've worked in Africa, I have relatives in New Zealand, I've traveled the world, I've lived in different contexts and had ministry in different contexts. And it was that beginning, that bus journey, that was the beginning of that adventure that became my life. And it started with being lost. And so I want us to think about that in the context of today's readings, because the readings are all about people, and even God is lost. And that wonderful conversation between God and Moses, and the GPS system for the Jewish community was the Jewish law. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods but me. And they're worshiping this golden calf. Here's God had freed his people from slavery in Egypt, and all the jewelry and the gold and the precious things that they had smuggled out of Egypt, they had melted down and turned into this golden calf that they were worshiping. And God was pretty angry, pretty resentful after all God had done for his people, that they were reverting to the old religion. They were going back to the old ways of the religion that was comfortable. And it was easier to connect with where they'd come from. Even if they were slaves, they knew their place. It was much more uncomfortable to go forward into the unknown, to the promised land. So the people were lost. And the way they dealt with it is they wanted to look backwards. The golden calf. And Moses, it's interesting, this conversation that Moses has with God. He is the guy who's in the breach. He's standing. When an army would conquer a city, a walled city, they would do one of two things. They'd either starve the city into submission, or they would breach the wall of the city before they would take it over. So Moses is standing in the breach between God and destruction. God is ready to erase this experiment called humanity. And Moses uses some very clever techniques to argue with God and make God change his mind. And it may be in this story that even God is lost. And the way Moses does it, first of all, he says, well, it's rather like a married couple arguing over their child. Well, your son did this. And Moses says, no, this is your people, God. And then Moses used the technique, what would the neighbors think? Well, what would the Egyptians think if you destroyed this people that you freed from slavery? It doesn't make you look good. And then the third technique was to remind God of what God had already promised in Abraham and the prophets and the sages and all the people that God had committed to. And so God says, let me be alone. God has a little God time. Let me be alone. And then God decides not to destroy this relationship with God's people. It's a lovely story, powerful story. And we don't think about the way in which sometimes God gets lost, and these people who argue with God and represent humanity to help to change the personality of God. So Moses is this guy standing in the breach, and he represents the people, and God listens and cools down. And this second reading we had is that famous Pharisee Saul of Tarsus. And here is Saul. He's got his GPS Jewish laws, all 600 and something of them. He is following the law of God because he wants to be a good human being. He wants to be on the right path. And then he realizes that this turns him into a monster. He is pious, he is self-righteous, he is even violent. And this letter is a kind of confession that he was lost. And he has this experience of Jesus who turns up one day and says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he is full of anger and rage and resentment at these people who are following Jesus. And he is the most unlikely person on the planet that God would use to intervene to proclaim this gospel of inclusion and reconciliation. And he goes, and it's the community in Damascus that take him in, broken and blind, and they heal him. And they point him in the right direction. And he is forever grateful for that mercy. The mercy of Jesus and the mercy of the people of Jesus. So this amazing transformation that he's talking about, a way in which his anger and resentment and his loss, it's interesting how we all deal with loss differently, that is changed and transformed into something else. Someone once told me, it was a great phrase, that resentment is like someone who swallows poison and then waits for their enemy to die. Resentment is like swallowing poison and then waits for their enemy to die. And so whether it is God's resentment against his own people, disappointed, or whether it's Paul or his brother Pharisees resenting Jesus' ministry of social and religious inclusion, how dare Jesus dine with tax collectors and sinners? Tax collectors, they betrayed our country, they betrayed our culture and our religion. He's not on the GPS road to the kingdom. And it's interesting that the critics of Jesus, these Pharisees, the way in which Jesus deals with their resentment, he tells them a story about loss that ends in joy. And it's a wonderful story because the shepherd and the woman, it's interesting, the coin and the sheep haven't done anything wrong. They're kind of morally neutral. If anything, the people who've done wrong is the shepherd and the woman who lose the coin and the sheep. And then they find something that they already owned, and then they are grateful. There is this joy. And they don't just keep it to themselves, but they share it with their community. It's a very important. And the way in which gratitude is, in fact, the antidote to resentment. And a way in which we claim, we see something maybe that we had taken for granted, and all of a sudden that person, that relationship, that possession is no longer here, and we didn't appreciate it to begin with. We take it for granted. Very good, this idea that gratitude is the antidote to resentment. And sometimes our fear of loss or fear of failure that has become an epidemic in our society expresses itself in this form or types of sabotage. Another story from my childhood, when I was about 14, 15, it's a very difficult age for all children, but we were beginning what we call the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where the community was rising up in violence against one another. That was the bigger picture that, as a teenager, I was growing up with. And my parents were going through a divorce. And a divorce in the 70s was lots of stigma, lots of problems. And I felt this enormous pressure in this very academic school that I was in, and I just couldn't handle it. And so the way I handled it was I played truant for about 5 weeks. I just unplugged from school. And I would hide my satchel under an old piece of tin, and I'd go off to the city, and I'd go to museums, and I was bored out of my tree, but I couldn't handle what was expected of me. And the sad thing was that I wasn't noticed. I was lost, and nobody noticed. My parents were too preoccupied. My school didn't notice. And when eventually they did, my teacher, Miss Arthur, talked to my parents, all hell broke loose. And I expected that I was going to be expelled. I thought that was deserved. I would have to go in front of our frightening headmaster and be humiliated. And instead, what was amazing about that story, it ended in grace. There was this acceptance and love. My chums in school, they gave me a hero's return. Anybody who could play truant for 5 weeks must be okay. And I was accepted. I didn't have to go to the headmaster. And I kind of buckled down and I started studying. And I realized that I had a second chance. And what was interesting, I started going to church about this time, and I realized that there was someone up there that was looking out for me. And that was incarnated in Miss Arthur, my teacher. And those individuals, and then in my church community, I grew in, I had my biological family, and my parents got together again 4 or 5 years later. Marriages are always complicated. But the church family also gave me enormous support and encouragement. And I turned my life over to God. But if I hadn't gone through that loss and that sense of failure, I would not have experienced the mercy and the grace and the joy of returning to full community and living into something that the community saw in me. So we shouldn't be frightened by loss, and we shouldn't be frightened by failure. You know, we live in a world, you know, we used to use the term helicopter parents, right? They'd be flying over, they'd be looking over their children, making sure that they're not going to fail, or they're not going to suffer, or nothing bad is going to happen to them. And school officials now call that syndrome the Snow-plow syndrome, where the parents are like a snowplow in front of their children to make sure that nothing ever is going to get in the way of their happiness and success. And this week on the news, we just manifested the most extreme version of this through the pay for play. Some of the best universities in this country were involved in this ridiculous fear of failure on behalf of some of our families. And the church may be one of the few institutions in our society that we learn from our ancestors that it's okay to fail, that it's okay to get lost, and it's okay to ask for help. And that there's something deeply human and also deeply divine, as we hear from the story of Moses, in that process. My parents were far from perfect, but thank God they did not know how to snowplow me into my future. I would have become a very different person and a very different priest if that had been the case. With all of the successes and failures of that journey, rejoice with me, for that which was lost has been found. And after 65 years on this planet, far from perfect, the church is one of the very few institutions where we have an inbuilt message from ancient wisdom that lostness and failure are not to be avoided at all costs, but are indeed a necessary part of human and divine qualities that make creation full, interesting, and worth fighting for. And so don't come to church because you don't measure up. Don't come to church because it's full of hypocrites and does not feed you or tell you what you want to hear. Come because you're lost and you're broken, and you want to stop poisoning yourself with resentment and anger at a world that doesn't see who you are. Come not because you're good, a great parent, or a wonderful contributor to society, but maybe, just maybe, you are crying inside to find that bus stop that will take you home. Rejoice with me, for that which was lost has been found. Amen.